Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Meg Riggs. I'm the Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe. It is my great honor to welcome everybody who is here in person as well as those who are watching virtually. This is a reminder, this is on the record, because the world is watching virtually, and this is on YouTube and on Facebook Live as we have this conversation. You are the selected few who get to be in the room and engage directly with our special speaker today, who will be traveling to Zimbabwe shortly to have more in-person meetings. So go through this evening with that in mind. I have the pleasure of introducing our Deputy Chief of Mission, Alex Avelamont, who he and I didn't realize this until tonight, both joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 2000, so we both kind of go back to the same time. He has served all over the world, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's been with us here for the last 3 years, both in our front office and part of the consular team. And it is my great pleasure to turn the mic over to him.
Thanks, Meg, for that introduction and for a great many other things as well. One of the many things I like about my job is that I get to hang out with a bunch of really smart, dedicated, amazing people, both colleagues and also just the people in civil society and the entrepreneurial space and business and other government agencies that we interact with. As diplomats, we generally are I would consider it a generalist. Like, I'm kind of a jack of all trades and certainly a master of none. I love then when I get to meet and interact with people like you all here in the room today and our people who are participating online, who are really good at some very amazing things that I don't know anything about. That always inspires me because I just love to learn and absorb what other people are passionate about. There's a great quote, I'll kind of mangle it, but I'll try to paraphrase it. That it's, I think, by Arthur C. Clarke, and he said that basically, if you're in a society and you encounter technology that is far more advanced than you can understand, you basically consider it magic. And that to me is what I think about when I think about 5G. Like, I still think 2G is kind of cool, and like 3G might be too much. 5G apparently is amazing and blows the doors out of 2G. It's like 2.5 times better, apparently. I don't know. Maybe it's logarithmic. I don't know. But I think we can fuse that in other ways. And I really enjoyed my conversation earlier, just kind of part of it, talking about some of the benefits, but also maybe some of the questions that these advanced technologies propose. One of them, I think, is when we look at, from my perspective, we look at Zimbabwe as one part of a kind of a strategic competition here in Africa. And there's a renewed focus on Africa from our administration, from our president. And I'll talk a little bit about how that interrelates with what we're doing here. But I think it's important to look aside of the geopolitics for a minute and look at what some of these things that we're trying to promote can do. And that is really create win-win solutions. And I think even in this kind of realm of geopolitical, geostrategic competition, there's always room for, it doesn't need to be zero sum. It can be win-win. And that's one of the things I'm really proud about what our administration is doing here to promote something like 5G. So before I kind of get into a little bit more details, I want to kind of acknowledge the speakers that we have today. So we have Ivana Hu I think is on our call here remotely. We have Lawrence Nkala here, who's going to speak with us as well. I'm also just going to, as an aside, add that I'm quite jealous of all the people who can drink wine right now and stay awake for the next few hours. I hope Ivana, if Ivana's in the United States, I hope she's joining us with some wine. I will not tell anyone, even though the world is apparently watching.
Irish whiskey is the way to go.
I'm way too much of a lightweight. So let me just go into some details real quick about kind of 5G as I understand it. And again, I'm probably telling people going to be correcting me like, no, that's not right. What it is, of course, the transformative technology that can really benefit every bit of our lives. And like I said, to me, it seems like indistinguishable from magic, but obviously there's a lot of tech that goes into it. Early returns of the 5G that's been installed here have kind of made futuristic references like the future has finally arrived. People I know around the world are awaiting 5G internet and the revolutions it can promise for any number of good things. What I like about kind of how we're promoting it is this kind of collaborative promotion, methodology or strategy that we have. As you may be aware, our president has really been making a push for greater engagement with Africa through the African Leaders Summit. through the kind of parallel U.S.-Africa Business Summit last December. And that's where he launched the Digital Transformation with Africa initiative. Let me give you just some kind of highlights about that. It's designed to expand digital access, expand commercial relations, support digital literacy, and strengthen cyber environments across the continent, which kind of complements a bunch of our other strategies. What we really want out of this is an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. I think the future of the internet is something that's of great concern to many people, especially in the developing world. And what people call a digital ecosystem, which I think is kind of an ironic term because the ecosystem, of course, is a natural environment. But I'm also a fan of science fiction, and I read all the cyberpunk novels where you have this crazy ecosystem. So, but to advance that in a way that, again, we can do this without harming our own interests. In fact, one of the key American strategic interests in the world is the promotion of liberal values, including liberal commercial values, and the idea that this kind of rising tide lifts all boats, that we can, through the act of commerce between multiple countries and individuals, make everybody's life better. And we have, I don't know, 60 years worth of evidence that supports that since the end of World War II and the greater liberalization of trade and the kind of rules-based international order that we've all helped establish. And that's kind of what we're getting at, because we can do well and do good. We can do right by each other. We can expand all this wonderful technology and makes people's lives much easier. And we can also be fortunate to benefit from that as a nation, while we see our partners around the world benefit from that as well. So that's kind of one of the great things as well that I like about my job, is I get to kind of evangelize for things like this. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. And we had a great chat about how, especially post-pandemic, people are spending a lot of time isolated because they've been on their devices so long, and this connection to the world, to everything everywhere all at once, to borrow a term, can have some cost to it as well. But if you were to go back 30 years, I had to teach my kids once, as an aside, how to dial a rotary phone. You hated your friends that had 2 zeros in the number because right? So you can be nostalgic for that age, and you can remember things that were better about that age. But over time, you wouldn't want to go back to it, because so much is better today. And a lot of that has to do with technology. So I'm really pleased to be here with you people who all have apparently an amazing tolerance for alcohol that is more than one glass. I'm just jealous on that alone. With these brilliant, smart, inspirational people, both here and on the other side of cyberspace over there. I really want to welcome you all to this beautiful space in our embassy, with our art and our ability to convene people. Our public diplomacy section, as I've been bragging to the people I've talked to, is the best in the embassy at bringing people here to do this. So I want to give them a big kudos. When the PD section writes remarks for me, Bhutto wrote some remarks for me one day, and I was like, yeah, whatever, I don't need those. So I've done my best to adhere to the remarks so that they don't think I'm ignoring them. But no, I want to give big kudos to our PD team. And I know we have other colleagues kind of sprinkled out throughout the event here. So please pull them aside and engage in conversation. And I just want to thank everybody for coming. And at that, I'm going to sit down and finish my water and try to stay, it's actually vodka, but no, just kidding. Thank you.
Can I have your bio page?
Yeah. It's that one.
All right, for the main event, it is a great pleasure for us to invite Ivana Hu is the CEO of Omelius, the artificial intelligence and machine learning company in the United States. Several people in this room actually reached out to us and asked for an opportunity to engage on these issues. And we went back to Washington and said, who is the expert you suggest? And this was the first name that came to mind. And so I would love to hand the mic over to her.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming to the event. And hopefully this will be a lively discussion. I'm going to kick off the conversation by talking about the global trends and the challenges of deploying 5G. And then I will hand it over to my colleague who will talk specifically about the context in Zimbabwe. And then we'll make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask us any questions. So in my section, I'm going to go through a bunch of different things. You can pick out any one of them a little bit later, but I'm going to try to make it around 8 to 10 minutes so you're not in a wine-induced nap by the end of it. So with that, I'm also going to share my screen. Oh, and I can't share my screen. Can you give me the rights to share my screen? I can just move ahead, and then once it's there, I can share my screen. All right,
Great.
so what is 5G? 5G is just the fifth generation of cellular networks. But what's different from the previous generation is that it is not only new investment in hardware, even in its open RAN configuration, which is one of the three things that we'll talk about in terms of the different formats of 5G. But it's also known for its wide application for economic growth, from financial markets to generative AI to smart cities, and all the applications that are currently deployed or are in the process of being deployed. And so it's really a game changer when it comes to GDP growth. But what exactly is 5G, right? So when we're talking about 5G, we're really talking about anywhere between 1 to 6 gigahertz of radio waves. Anything below 1 gigahertz is basically the previous generation. And then between 1 and 6, this is where showing my screen will be kind of helpful. It's really hard
you should be able to do that now.
Okay, sweet. Yes. Awesome. Can you see my screen? Okay. So this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier about all of the applications of 5G that we know about. So it's not only about being able to provide Wi-Fi at large scale events for thousands of users on the lower side, which can also be done with 3G or 4G. But as you're moving to the right, from vehicle communications to environmental and monitoring smart cities, all the way to the connection of multiple IoT devices. And I will also add in, being able to compute at a very fast pace, especially when it comes to the development of AI and being able to play around with chatbots that we all have heard so much about in the media. When it comes to 5G, so this is the way that we think about spectrum, both allocation, but also the speed, right? And this graph is great because it also shows you sort of the trade-offs that you'll have to make when it comes to even the various speed of 5G. So all of these, the low bands, mid bands 1, mid bands 2, and high bands, the mid bands 1 to high bands is what we really consider as 5G. No one is really at the high bands right now. Everyone's sort of in the a little bit of the low band, and then really clumped into the mid bands and mid band 1 and mid bands 2. But one thing you will notice is that the great thing about 3, 4G is you get a massive amount of coverage, which is fantastic when you're working in rural communities and also when there are geographic barriers like mountains and the altitude is changing constantly as well. So low bands for that context is a lot easier. But of course, what you're giving up is a low capacity and then very low speed. And as you're going up, this is where when you go up all the way to the high bands, it's very limited amount of coverage, huge capacity, and very, very low latency. This is typically also reserved. I'm not sure how it is in Zimbabwe, but in terms of high bands in the US and in most Western countries, they're primarily reserved for government, for typically emergency vehicles, the military, or any of those national security apparatuses. And so they're typically not really allowed to be auctioned off unless it's a very specific use case. Whereas the mid bands, both of them are where the auctions are actually happening in terms of giving them to carriers. All right. This is going to get a little bit technical. You don't have to understand all of this, but the reason why I put it up is because when we're talking about 5G, we're not only talking about, you know, the fact that a lot of the telco carriers would have to have licenses in order to request the allocation of spectrum, but the consumers, whether that's an individual or business, would also have to have devices that will allow for 5G. Right now, most of the phones post 2020 have the ability to actually or have the ability to use 5G, but there are definitely phones still out there that will not allow you to be on 5G. And then there are, you know, three major variations of 5G. You have the centralized, which is your very typical your base stations. Everything is super focused on hardware. And then you have Open RAN. So Open RAN is right here. It's based on open interfaces. And typically this is done within an alliance or an industry and provides for the most interoperability. It doesn't have to be virtual, although a lot of Open RAN is virtual. And when we're talking about virtual, what we're talking about is it's less reliant on hardware, but it's much more focused on cloud storage. So the reason why those two are increasingly popular is because with Open RAN, you don't run into the issues of interoperability within the country, within specific carriers, but also internationally. So if you want the ability for people to call both Zimbabwe and Botswana or South Africa at the same time, that will be a lot easier to facilitate in terms of the tech integration. With virtual, it's really being led by a Japanese company called Rakuten. And Rakuten has tested this in Tokyo, primarily because they wanted to see if it will work with a huge number of people. But they've also tested it in rural Alaska, where, you know, there are a lot of forests and there are trees and there are animals and all of these and virtual RAN still worked really well for 5G. And one of the reasons why, and the primary reason why people started exploring other options to the very centralized traditional model of integration is basically because 5G is really expensive, right? I believe there are, 22 base towers right now in Zimbabwe, but they're very, very expensive. They're hard to pay off. And we can talk about that a little bit later, but the other issue too is vendor lock-in. Because you're so reliant on hardware, the hardware would also have to be compatible. And so if you start with Ericsson or if you start with Huawei, you're basically locked into those vendors for everything else. And that it's just really hard from a business perspective to be like, oh yeah, once, you know, they know that they have a monopoly, are they going to gouge prices in the future? Or are they just going to decrease services for you in 2 to 3 years because they know that you can't really go anywhere else? So the global trends right now is an increasing adoption of 5G and phasing out the legacy ones, and which also means that interoperability is important. So this graph is basically showing all of the 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and based on the regions of the world from 2019 to 2025. The 5G is highlighted in orange, and the green is LTE or 4G. So you'll see on your far right, which is North America, there's a huge jump of the orange from 2019, where it's like 2%, if that, to 74% in 2025. In the Middle East and Africa, you're looking second from the left. I'm not sure if it's the left for you guys. But for that, you see that there's in 2019, 5G doesn't exist. And then it's predicted to go up to 7% by 2025, while 4G is also increasing from 17% to 39%. And these are only focused on mobile, not landlines. All right. There are also a couple of downsides to 5G as well. One of them is you kind of have to make this trade-off between a security risk and the predatory pricing that happens when you do have a vendor lock-in when it comes to something like a centralized 5G, which is the reason why a lot of folks they're trying to push more for Open RAN or virtual RAN, or the combination of both of them. A lot of the predatory pricing that we're seeing right now, they don't really start in the first couple of years. They start to actually stack up typically 5 years down the line. And there's not much you can do because at that point, you're already locked in. And there's also a security concern of, if there is a security concern with one piece of the hardware, even if you decide that you're going to switch over to a virtual RAN configuration later, can you stack your secure cloud or software or hardware on top of that? What does that actually mean? That's something that we're still trying to figure out as a 5G community, because not everyone has the money to do something called rip and replace, which is something that the US did about 2-3 years ago, I believe, which the Senate essentially gave telcos about $1 billion to rip out all the Huawei gear and then replace them with what they consider as trusted vendors. Other downsides to 5G, just to consider, is that it does increase the digital divide, especially because 5G tends to occur in urban areas. That means that you're leaving out the rural communities, and increasingly as social services are becoming online, what does that actually say about the people who can't really access that high speed that's needed to fill out certain paperwork or to apply for things online? And also, now that everything is becoming an algorithm, if they're not counted in the training data set, then what does that actually mean for community inclusion as well? There's a lot of disinformation around 5G as well. In the UK, when COVID started, about 20 some cell towers got destroyed because people believed that 5G caused both COVID and cancer. The cancer one has been lingering for a lot longer than COVID, but that's something to also think about, is how do we actually educate the public about what 5G is? Because a lot of people, the way they think about it is, 5G is high-speed microwave, and microwaves cause, it's radiation, and so that causes a bunch of other diseases. So how do we actually go into a lot of the rural places where these attacks are happening, and making sure that they're also, they're knowledgeable and they understand the facts around 5G? I'm going to stop there. I know I mentioned a bunch of things. Feel free to ask me questions on any of the topics I raised or topics I have not talked about.
Thank you so much, Ivanahu. All right, I'm going to turn to our second speaker. We always try to have an American and then a Zimbabwe whenever we do these things. We have with us tonight Lawrence Nikala. He is an engineer and a telecommunications professional with extensive 28 years of experience in ICTs. He is currently the acting managing director for Tel1, and prior to that, he was the chief operating officer responsible for providing strategic leadership and the delivery of infrastructure, technology, and innovation solutions for a commercial function business. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
So thank you very much, Meg, for the opportunity to come here and talk about the exciting developments in the ICT sector. First of all, just to recognize colleagues in the US Embassy, the officials that are here, and also just to recognize the colleagues in the ICT sector and financial services sector, and notice that we've got the banks here. And a special recognition to the former MD of Tel1, my boss, who's here. So trying to fit in her shoes is quite a difficult task, but let me try. One of the dangers of digitization is that we carry smart devices with us. So when I came here, I thought I had a very good presentation, but the embassy officials said, no, you will not bring this in. So I have to be analog today and shoot from the head. So I'm not too sure whether I'll manage this conversation today. But the topic is around 5G, and I want to confess I'm not a real big expert around that, but I'll talk to some very key points around. I'm sure in the room there could be others that are very skilled in that space. But I want to bring the context first to talk about, before we delve into 5G, which is pretty much a technology, but to talk about the context in terms of digital transformation, where there is this big and much more triggered by COVID, the drive to use technologies as a way to improve our lives. Basically, I think all about transformation in digital space is to improve the quality of lives of individuals, improve the performance of our businesses, to improve generation of revenue, customer experience, our security issues, because we need these technologies to be able to see and predict using artificial intelligence what's going to come. So basically is to introduce efficiencies in what we do, even in respect to government services. You want to be able to access those services in the comfort of your home. You want to reduce cost of operations. So basically that's the idea. And how do the telcos fit in ICTs in this space? ICT, I would like to call it the telcos as the oil that lubricates the economy, and hence digital transformation leads into the digital economy. And what is digital economy? Digital economy, you are talking about the activities of a country or an economy that is driven by technology. So you look at your government, all the services that you access from them, business to government to business, business to business, business to consumer, all driven by technologies. And that makes efficiencies and the quality of lives improves, and therefore the economy and in general improves. So this is the context in which we want to discuss this. So 5G sits in the space of one of the technologies that have been identified through research and standardization through ITU through 3GPP, that was designed, number one, to have low latencies in terms of turnaround times for your data solutions and high speed access. And this finds very good use case in all industry verticals. In the medical space, you can conduct your surgery almost real time because you don't have round trip delay. And you've got your artificial intelligence that sits on the back of your 5G, which is a transport network and high speed access, to then have the intelligence to then go ahead and do the surgery process. You've got your automation in the mining sector. You now have underground autonomous vehicles that actually carry the minerals around. So you've got your IoTs in the space of smart cities that manages our refuse collection, that manages our traffic management in terms of lights, as well as vehicles, that manages our water system. So all that is part of the transformation that uses IoTs, artificial intelligence, and cloudification in terms of housing the intelligent solutions that drive the business. So this is the context in which we are. There would be other generations beyond 5G and 6G. Now people are talking about that in terms of development that brings in all host of advantages. So coming back to Zimbabwe, specifically talking about 5G and what is the landscape like. I'll start by talking about the regulatory environment, because everything that happens must be satisfy regulatory requirements. And the regulation in Zim in terms of spectrum assignment draws from the ITU radio regulations, which identified, like Ivan who spoke about 1G to 6G gigahertz in terms of spectrum identified for use for 5G. So in Zimbabwe, we do have three bands, in fact, 3 bands that have been identified for use for 5G. So we do have, the main band is 3.4 to 3.6, which is 200 megahertz spectrum. And for you to drive a meaningful 5G network, you need a minimum of around 80 megahertz. I'll explain a bit later. So we have got that spectrum, which is about 200, and we've got a spectrum below that, 3.3 to 3.4, which is 100 megahertz again, which is available. And then we've got the one that is currently to be debated and most likely allocated to 5G at the WRC 23 in Dubai this year, where administrations are pushing for allocation of that to 5G, seeing that there could be many players. Because spectrum is the one big limiting factor in terms of how many players you can have in an economy. So that is where we are in terms of regulation. So we are not yet ready. We have not assigned spectrum to any player. What is happening now, we have got one of our MNOs, Econet, who has deployed a couple of base stations, but is using a trial spectrum, which the regulator assigned on a trial basis. And I think they did give that to Net1 as well and Telecel, the MNOs. So the trial will also help smoothen the quantum of spectrum that will be assigned. As Econet experiments and they try this, load their base stations, they can assist the regulator come up with the requisite spectrum that can satisfy any operator to have a meaningful operation. The prime spectrum, which is 3.4 to 3.6, is currently occupied by some incumbents. So the regulator, why they haven't assigned spectrum is because these incumbents must vacate. They're given notices by June 2023. So once they vacate that main band, then it will avail spectrum for them to start assigning. Speaking to the regulator, the assignment method has not been found yet. They haven't decided on how this will happen. In other markets, it is auctioned, as you know. In Zim, so they are debating around whether auction or they will do administrative assignment, where they will just put in a price for the spectrum that per megahertz that they will charge. So that is work in progress, and the expectation is that before the end of the year, we will have an assignment that's made, and operators will either be going to auction and they bid, or there will be administrative assignment for that spectrum to any operator that applies. And they will make sure that everyone has a share. But like I said, in some markets, they're actually going up to 100 megahertz, minimum 80 megahertz. So I said we've got 200, we've got 100, we've got 190. So we put that together, and everyone else that wants to come in here, this is the situation. Unfortunately, you can't extend spectrum. It is fixed. It is harmonized with other regions in SADC and in Africa to avoid interference. So the 5G spectrum is globally assigned. In other areas, you'll find Asia is using different spectrum, but in this particular one, WRC, which is a major conference that decides on assignment of spectrum, the decision was made that globally, and for purposes of having a standardized equipment and having a very robust ecosystem, you then have to have a globally assigned spectrum. So you don't have certain equipment manufactured designed for America and the other one for Japan and the other one for Africa. So this time around, they try to harmonize that. So The Zim is poised, like any other developing country, Zimbabwe and Africa and some other developing countries. We are consumer of technologies. We don't really manufacture. Other countries, Western Europe, you have Asia, they've got manufacturers and operators. So in our side of the country, so we've got players that consume technologies, and we tend to lag behind for reasons of having to be assured that the risk issues have been addressed, because our pockets are not that deep. So you want to make sure that the technology has matured. One of the biggest issues in Africa is the device ecosystem. So they don't come cheap for 5G, and currently there are manufacturers that are trying to come up with a cheaper brand for the smartphones that can do a 5G access. But we also have fixed wireless access as a method. In fact, widely, even in Asia, the 5G is deployed using fixed wireless access, where for the consumer market, you can have a terminal customer premises equipment that convert the 5G signal into the ordinary Wi-Fi, so that anyone else who've got any smartphone with a Wi-Fi access can do that. So this is what is happening largely in South Africa with RAIN, and coupled with the mobile broadband access, where you have to have your 5G enabled devices. So basically, this is where we are in Zim. So I come from Tel1, and maybe lastly, Tel1 comes from an incumbent operator, incumbent as was the only one at the time, and it was unbundled into Tel1, Net1, and Zimpost in 2000, and the formation of the regulator Potras. You know, at the time, Tel1 PTC was the operator as well as the regulator, and it happened in all the markets. So in 2000, this hype around when the MNOs came into existence, so there was need to unbundle, so that the MNOs were faced with, the MNOs out of incumbent operators were faced with competition for new entrants, which competition did not have any legacy issues. So there's a drive to unbundle so that they make this guy nimble. So this is how Net1 was formed. But again, coming into 2010 into 2015, they realized once again that for a mobile network to run, they need fixed resources. So they need fiber for that matter. So at the end of the day, there was this consolidation. So as we stand today, Tel1 holds a unified telecommunication services license, which allows it to run mobile and fixed solutions. So this is why our interest is very high on 5G, particularly on fixed wireless access deployment, which is the roadmap to the future for further generations. Thank you very much for what I could collect from my head. This is what I could deliver.
I think we'll all agree he was incredibly persuasive, and I think you know your craft is what comes across. And sometimes just writing the speech, having it shaped in your mind, and then you're able to deliver those points more fluidly in a natural way. All right, questions for this evening. If people are slow, I have one, but I would rather it come from all of you. Introduce yourself. We've got a mic as well, yes? Becca, we've got a mic on that end. It's coming. All right, it's coming. There we go. It's not for you.
Speaker, like 5G is fairly new phenomenon, and just want to understand if there been any studies that can actually verify whether or not there's a link between GDP growth and 5G deployment.
I can between now and end of the year. So globally, 5G will generate 2.7 billion United States dollars worth of income. And this is about 314% increase in 12 months. So we're looking at 27 billion into 2027. And that's driving, in terms of GDP, they spoke about a 2.6% increase every year with deployments. There's an acknowledgement that it is too expensive to deploy 5G. And right now, most of the Asian and Western players that have commercialized it, they are just, I was in Barcelona in Mobile World Congress this year in March, and they were talking about just a percentage below what they expected in terms of income to break even. So it is quite an expensive investment, but they are relying on the developments of additional technologies like maturing of AI, of IoTs to drive the industry side, because that's where there is money that's going to cover the cost. Currently, the consumer market is taking up to 60% of the revenues. So you can imagine, and it is growing. It's us with our AV, our augmented reality, virtual reality at home, with our gaming, with all those gadgets that we have, our data we access for fintech services and other things that is driving the numbers there. But they need the big guys in the industry to take up new solutions, but that is hinged on developments of complementary technologies. Thank you.
The great part of having this conversation with you remotely is that I do have my devices, and there's a great PwC report called the Global Economic Impact of 5G, and I'd be happy to share this in the link with you guys. But basically, it is saying that currently, globally, 5G's economic impact is at $525 billion. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, that number is 180 billion.
And I'm soberly reminded last week at ZDIF, I think most of us were actually at the trade fair in Bulawayo. We actually did a bunch of QR code pages for, exchanges, how to study in the US. And I'd say 2/3 of the people who walked up didn't have phones that were modern enough to scoop the QR code. And so that was just a reminder of we can move ahead. Banking industry, we need to do this shift, but there is a divide. All right, our next question.
Thank you. You actually preempted my question.
Oh,
no. Yes. So my question is for Talwan, but coming from what the first speaker said. So she pointed, and like you rightfully pointed out, that in as much as 5G will increase GDP, it will make things better and faster and whatever, but for those who can afford. And coming back to Zim, we already are in a space where we already have the rural areas lagging behind. So there are places where you can't even get 4G or 3G for that matter. Mm-hmm. And we have children in school. So I'm very interested in encouraging the girl child to be in STEM. How is she going to do that when we are becoming so much faster and better here, and they're not where we were 10 years from now? Aren't we just increasing that divide? And so as a regulator, Talwan's not a regulator, but in regulation, are we actually going to think about that? Think about how we are going to move forward without leaving others behind or pushing them even further from where we actually are?
Yeah, please.
So yes, that's very correct. In Zim, I think all of us, we know that there's this mantra that no one and no place will be left behind. And in 5G, according to the regulator, there is already an assignment of a sub 1 gigahertz per second spectrum. Speaking to the regulator, they are working on trying to avail the 700 megahertz spectrum, which will then be used. It gives a wider coverage in the rural. So with one base station deployed, it will cover a wider community. Funding is one of the greatest problems that bedelve not only Zim, but typically all developing countries. But I'm happy to report that the regulator is some funding that they have from a Universal Services Fund that they use to deploy solutions that cater for the rural community. We do appreciate the work that they've done now with the computers, and all players, MNOs, including Tel1, have provided connectivity to those centers. But the bigger picture is the 5G spectrum below 1 gigahertz that the regulator is going to assign, and also the program to roll out towers in the rural community that then will be used to deploy other generations of mobile communication, including 5G. So we believe that will be covered as we roll out 5G also into the rural communities. Thank you.
Okay, I think he's already partly answered my question, so now it's more of a comment than a question. I think about 5 years ago, I saw a presentation done by someone at Singularity University, where they mapped out, the fact that any new technology or breakthrough innovation will become cheaper to scale over the years. And this is in retrospect, looking at maybe just anything you can think of, like the iPhone or anything else that's sort of come up over the years. And not being a tech expert, but somebody who's done a lot of work interfacing tech and science, the question or the comment would be around, and piggybacking off what she said, that what are the projections in terms of scaling 5G for it to be applicable for us and to be beneficial to us in the African context. And maybe a lot more effort needs to be put into looking into how we can actually deploy it and scale it at an affordable sort of cost and rate for all these countries. Because I saw even with Ivana's projections on where we'll be as a continent in terms of adoption of 5G by 2025, it's very low compared to sort of the US and elsewhere. And these are sort of the things we need to be looking at to say, why are we looking at it and saying maybe in the next 5 to 10 years it's not going to be, it's still going to be expensive. Why is it still going to be expensive? And yeah, with technology developing the way it is, I guess that question might only be answered in the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
I'm curious Ivana, if there's examples or experiences that you've seen in other parts of the world that could be applicable here. I hate learning a lesson someone else already learned.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some other countries in the Middle East and Africa where the telcos are being more, I guess, active in the value add services that they're providing, and not only teaching and educating people about 5G, but also allowing certain apps to be on their 5G network for free. These tend to be where you're enrolling your kids into schools and paying for school fees, and that would be connected to their mobile payment system that people are using. There are also a bunch of fintech tools that they have made available at 5G speed. However, it so goes back to the question of you still need a device that is able to take 5G. And that is unfortunately still pretty rare. There are some nonprofits out there that are trying to subsidize the costs of 5G devices. But that's not you know, like I'm just being totally frank, like that doesn't sound as great as I'm helping a bunch of people get access to water, which is a lot more essential.
And I think it brings us back to why are we having this conversation this evening? Why is the U.S. Embassy doing this? Again, this isn't just a 5G series. This was a leadership in tech series. What we're hoping to do over the coming months is have a series of speakers, having people like Ivana come out and actually spend time brainstorming with some of you and thinking through how do we do this better? How do we apply what's known, as well as other experts in the space. There's a lot of policy and tech and education questions that I think we all need to be exploring together, because companies can want one thing, but if the universities aren't pivoting to meet you in that space, then you don't have the graduates you need to hire. If banks can't hire the right tech people, then they can't even think about the tech they want to apply and where they go. And so this is a holistic conversation. We've even talked about having speakers come and talk about how to parent your children in this new world, because the reality is we're all maneuvering. I have a 13-year-old, and all week Google has written to me to say she will have new rights at the end of this week. Do you want her to have new rights? No, I don't want her to have new rights. And so I think it's leadership in tech, because it touches so much of what we do, and what we need to be doing is having the discussions and sharing the data and looking at the examples and engaging with each other, so that you come to an outcome or come to a solution that everyone is comfortable with, or most people are comfortable with, and that really has explored all of your options. And so this is just one of our conversations. 5G isn't the only discussion, I think, is what this evening has given us. We have a couple minutes left. We have one more question hidden in the back behind one of the cameras.
Hello, sorry, I have a weak voice. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, my question is, as a non-expert, I think I look at Zimbabwe and I think, is it realistic to chase 5G? Because right now I was looking at the average 5G speeds globally, and we're in the 300 megabits per second range, which is still in really good 4G territory. And I'm thinking, okay, can we not, since 4G is cheaper to deploy, can we not focus on improving our 4G infrastructure right now? Because we do have 4G in Zimbabwe, but we get nowhere near the really good 4G speeds that other countries get. Should we not, we cannot ignore 5G completely and be left behind. Effort into improving our 4G to get to the 100 megabits per second kinds of speeds. And I think some of the use cases we hear about, those would be possible at those speeds. I guess the latency would be a problem, but for most of the applications we currently have, I think 5G would serve us so well, and it is cheaper to deploy now. So should that be our focus?
You meant 4G, yes?
Yeah, 4G. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Should we still focus on 4G, or should we actually put more effort into improving our 4G rather than getting into this more expensive, less range per base station and all this? That's my question there.
I'm going to pass that back to our speaker in the US. How have you seen other people grapple with this question?
What you're saying makes a lot of sense. What we're seeing typically is that they do want to expand their 4G, but you also have to think that the hardware for 4G is going to become outdated in a couple years when everyone's switching to 5G, and then there's going to be an interoperability concern. So some people are thinking, well, maybe we should just leapfrog directly to 5G, especially when we're using open or virtual RAN. There's also the perception, right, perspective of politically, it looks really good on the international stage. And so a lot of the regulators are also thinking about that. And they're also trying to grapple, and they're kind of clumping 5G with AI and social media kind of all together when they're trying to address data privacy concerns. And how do we actually think about regulations around that? And so that's where the 5G conversation once again becomes pretty important, just because it is the basic infrastructure.
Who has not gotten to ask a question? I think over here. I see Ree asks, but
Thank you very much. I'm into financial inclusion, and connectivity is at the core of what we do. And what I've realized is the 5G networks are mostly confined to urban areas. And will it really drive financial inclusion going into the future, maybe the next 3 to 5 years? Then number two is the issue to do with sustainability. I usually grapple with my team on issues to do with reporting on ESG. How is the 5G, how are the 5G networks going to impact issues to do with power consumption and the effect on the environment?
I'd love to hear there's some bankers in this room. I'd love to hear some answers from within the room. Come on, Stanbeck. Come on, CBZ. I know. Yeah, exactly. The bank wasn't supposed to ask that.
I'm just thinking, for Zimbabwe, what is the hope for us? If we don't work with the financial services sector, they don't handhold us somehow, and we collaborate to come up with some kind of mechanism that works to come up with a 5G establishment. Even if what Lawrence spoke about of the spectrum being still, experimented on, just assume that maybe the spectrum will be there. But what hope is there for us? We need the financial services sector to be on the table for the 5G deployments. Otherwise, we'll run the risk of one, perhaps the vendor risk is really very high. You then just get one or two vendors who can then just come and they also then stipulate conditions on us, and it becomes very, very expensive over time. So I think the telecom sector needs to have some kind of latitude in terms of funding, so that they can select vendors not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. And perhaps we need almost like the whole ecosystem on the table, where we agree that this is what we're going to do, and we are going to be capacitated.
I don't think I could improve upon that. I'm going to give our special speakers one last word. Do you want to say one last thing, or did she steal your thunder?
No, I just to comment on the experience that I've had with technologies, because he asked the question, why are we not perfecting our 4G? So you will find out that as you run your network, you then fail to get support for the various network elements you need. And the market is moved to 5G, so you have no choice. So my recommendation would be that when such technologies are getting mature, you just need to leapfrog. You still maintain the 4G and optimize it, but just have a foothold into the next generation and become relevant. Otherwise, you have no support and then you collapse. Yeah, thank you.
And Ivana, would you like to say one last thing before we wrap up this evening?
No, I think she was very eloquent. Oh, I'm good.
Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, both virtual and present this evening, thank you so much for joining us for our first in the series for Leadership in Tech. We love the conversation that has started this evening. Again, this is a conversation. It wasn't meant to tell you what to do. It was to get people thinking and talking and exploring their options. And we hope that we're a trusted partner in this conversation. So thank you all very much. Good night and good luck.